Snoop Dogg, a global icon, faces blatant racial discrimination during a first-class flight when he's ignored and humiliated by flight attendants, culminating in his forced removal from the plane at a remote airport. Despite his calm composure, the captain and crew's biased actions, rooted in prejudice, leave Snoop abandoned on the tarmac. This unjust treatment exposes deep-seated racism within the airline industry, igniting a larger movement as Snoop vows to fight not only for himself, but for others who've suffered similar injustices, demanding accountability and systemic change. On an exclusive first-class flight, a renowned international music icon found himself at the center of a shocking episode of blatant discrimination. Snoop Dogg, celebrated for his global influence and laid-back persona, was just beginning what should have been a serene and luxurious escape when an unexpected ordeal began to unfold. The flight crew, led by a dismissive captain and an indifferent head attendant, wielded their power in a manner that not only humiliated Snoop, but forced him off the aircraft in a remote area. Yet through it all, Snoop's resolve remained unwavering. What began as an affront turned into a fight for justice, one that would resonate with many who stood against prejudice. Snoop Dogg, an iconic figure whose name is recognized worldwide, was eager to unwind after weeks of intense work. He had just boarded a private first-class flight, looking forward to some well-deserved rest as he headed to the Maldives. An idyllic destination with pristine white sands and crystal-clear waters awaiting him. The moment he stepped into the first-class cabin, it felt like a slice of heaven. The interior was a picture of luxury, with plush leather seats so expansive they could easily double as sofas. Soft, ambient lighting bathed the space, complementing its sleek modern design. The cabin had a timeless elegance, with smooth jazz playing softly in the background, a fitting soundtrack for the peace Snoop had been craving. With a contented sigh, he leaned back, momentarily closing his eyes to absorb the calmness of the experience. A flight attendant approached with a smile, offering him a chilled glass of fresh watermelon juice. "If you need anything else, just let me know," she said in a warm tone. Snoop, ever gracious, took the glass with a smile. "Perfect, thank you," he responded in his smooth, velvety voice. He raised the glass in a quiet toast, savoring the sweet, refreshing taste that washed away the fatigue of his demanding schedule. Sliding his sunglasses slightly down, he leaned into the chair, selected some soothing music on his phone, and relaxed into the rhythm. The light shimmered off the airplane's wing, giving it a golden glow, a perfect metaphor for the dreamlike journey ahead. But even as Snoop tried to soak in the tranquility, something felt amiss. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. From the corner of his eye, he noticed the subtle, yet unmistakable glances directed at him by a few passengers. The elderly man sitting nearby studied him intently, while an airport staff member's forced smile lingered too long as he passed by the gate. Another flight attendant seemed to give him a brief, scrutinizing look as she handed him his juice. Snoop tried to dismiss these unsettling observations as mere coincidences, but they tugged at the edges of his calm. He tried to shrug off the unease, convinced it was nothing, but it slowly crept under his skin. The tranquil atmosphere he had been hoping for now felt slightly off-kilter. Snoop couldn't have predicted that the seemingly perfect flight was about to devolve into something much darker, a trial that would challenge his patience and his principles in ways he had not anticipated. As Snoop enjoyed his fruit juice, his mind began to sharpen. His eyes remained hidden behind his dark glasses, but his sharp instincts sensed something was wrong. He saw how the flight attendants interacted with the other passengers, especially the couple seated in front of him. They received personalized service, attentive questions, smiles, and a clear effort to make them feel at ease. But when the flight attendant approached Snoop's row, something shifted. Without so much as a glance, she walked past him, ignoring his presence entirely. He called out softly, "Excuse me, I think I missed the menu?" His voice, though polite, carried a hint of confusion. The attendant stopped, her eyes flickering toward him. "We're out of menus," she replied curtly, her tone flat, dismissive, and cold. Snoop, taken aback, glanced around the cabin. The other passengers were all holding menus, some even placing them on their side tables. "Are you sure?" Snoop asked, keeping his voice light. "There should be others." But she only shot him a look that was laced with something deeper than simple inconvenience. I already said we're out, she snapped before walking away, offering no explanation or apology. Snoop took a breath, trying to regain his composure, but the sting of that encounter lingered. As he watched the scene unfold, it became clearer that this wasn't a random oversight. This was intentional, a deliberate dismissal that felt far from accidental. He noticed the arrival of the senior flight attendant, a woman with a commanding presence. Her hair was pulled tightly into a bun, and her gaze was sharp, scanning the cabin as she walked through. When her eyes landed on Snoop, she paused. Her brow furrowed briefly, her lips pressed into a thin line, and then she quickly looked away. That brief moment was enough to confirm what Snoop had already suspected. This wasn't simply a mistake, it was discrimination. But instead of reacting in anger, he chose to stay composed, to observe and assess the situation with the quiet dignity he had cultivated over his decades-long career. Yet the icy, dismissive behavior was not lost on him. He could sense the unspoken message, "You don't belong here." The meal service soon began, and Snoop could hear the sound of cutlery clinking as the attendant served gourmet dishes to the other passengers. The middle-aged couple in front of him received a beautifully plated meal: braised beef, fresh greens, and a glass of fine wine. The attendant leaned in, asked about their preferences, and smiled as she served them with care. But when it was Snoop's turn, things took a stark turn. A different attendant arrived, and with no fanfare or politeness, set a plastic tray in front of him. The meal looked nothing like the others: dry chicken, cold potato wedges, and a stale biscuit. It was as though he were being treated like an afterthought. No apology, no explanation, and certainly no smile. Snoop glanced down at the meal, then looked around the cabin. His tray stood in glaring contrast to the beautifully presented dishes of the other passengers. His eyes moved back to the attendant. "Excuse me," he said, his voice still calm but now carrying an edge. "I believe there's been a mistake. This isn't the first-class meal." The attendant hesitated, looking to the head attendant standing across the aisle. After a long pause, she shrugged and replied, "This is all we have left. Sorry." There was no effort to make it right, no attempt to offer a better solution. Snoop's patience was wearing thin, but he chose not to escalate things in that moment. He quietly acknowledged the injustice and continued to observe, knowing that this was far from the end of the story. Little did he know, this incident would soon lead him into a battle for fairness, one that would send a ripple of change far beyond the aircraft. Snoop Dogg placed the tray aside, his patience fraying at the edges. The food in front of him wasn't just underwhelming, it was an insult. He could feel the deliberate disregard from the flight attendants, and the weight of the injustice began to settle heavily in his chest. "This meal doesn't reflect the level of service I paid for," Snoop said, trying to keep his voice level, though his disappointment was palpable. "Could you check again, please?" The attendant's face remained impassive as she turned away, a subtle signal to the head purser standing nearby. The senior attendant approached with an air of authority that seemed to radiate from her every step. Her sharp, calculating gaze swept over Snoop, lingering on him before she spoke. "Your meal is entirely appropriate," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Perhaps the issue lies more with your expectations than with our service." Snoop could feel the weight of mockery in her tone, but he refused to let it shake him. His voice was steady, though the anger simmered beneath the surface. "My expectation," he replied with quiet resolve, "is to be treated fairly, like every other passenger. This is first class, isn't it?" The purser raised an eyebrow, folding her arms as she assessed him. Her next words were deliberate, and each syllable felt like an accusation. "People like you don't usually belong here." The cabin seemed to freeze at the utterance, as if the air had thickened with tension. A few passengers glanced up, their faces etched with confusion and discomfort. The words hung in the air, their meaning clear. Snoop was not welcome here. He straightened in his seat, his sunglasses reflecting the cold, calculating gaze of the purser. His voice was calm, but the steel of his resolve was unmistakable. "People like me?" he asked, his tone sharp with challenge. "What exactly do you mean by that?" The purser simply shrugged, refusing to address him directly. Without another word, she turned and walked away, signaling that the matter was closed. But the impact of her words lingered in the cabin, like a dark cloud. Prejudice had been laid bare for all to see, and it was as if every eye in the room was now trained on Snoop, waiting for him to react. Instead of losing his temper, Snoop reached for his phone. He opened a note-taking app and began to document the exchange, every detail, every word. This wasn't just a personal slight. It was part of a larger systemic issue. The injustice wasn't just happening to him. It was happening to anyone who didn't fit into the narrow confines of what others deemed acceptable. Snoop set the phone down, his mind racing. He leaned back into his seat, breathing deeply to steady himself. "I'll deal with this later," he told himself. But even as he tried to push the anger down, it burned within him, growing stronger with every passing second. The atmosphere in the cabin was thick with discomfort. The passengers around him remained silent, some avoiding eye contact, others sneaking glances as if afraid of drawing attention. It was the kind of silence that stung deeper than any words. And then, the door to the cockpit opened. The captain stepped into the cabin, a tall figure with broad shoulders and a square jaw, his silver hair neatly combed and his uniform pristine. His presence commanded attention, but it was the coldness in his eyes that sent a chill down Snoop's spine. The captain's gaze lingered on Snoop for a moment, before he made his way over, his steps slow and deliberate, as though he were walking to a confrontation, rather than just moving through the cabin. "Who are you?" the captain asked, his voice heavy with suspicion. "How did you end up in this section?" Snoop looked up at him, his demeanor unshaken. He was no stranger to being scrutinized, but the captain's question felt more like an accusation than a casual inquiry. "Good evening, sir," Snoop replied calmly. "I'm Snoop Dogg. I paid for this seat in full. If you'd like, all my details are in the system." Instead of taking a moment to acknowledge the information, the captain glanced around the cabin, almost as if seeking validation from the other passengers. Then leaning closer, he sneered, his tone sharp and dismissive. "I won't take your word for it. Do you have any documents to prove it? Show them to me now." Snoop's patience began to wear thin, but he kept his voice steady. "All my details were provided when I booked the flight. If you have doubts, you can check with your airline system instead of publicly interrogating me like this." The captain's response only seemed to inflame the situation. Crossing his arms, he barked, "People like you don't belong here. This is first class, and it's my job to ensure that everyone meets the standards." The words, though not overtly racial, carried an unmistakable implication. Snoop felt the sting of the captain's bias, the blatant disregard for his right to be there. The cabin grew unnervingly silent. The captain's insinuation was clear. Snoop didn't belong. The words hit Snoop hard, but instead of lashing out, he clenched his fists and took a deep breath. His voice, when it came, was low but resolute. "I'm not here to argue," he said. "If you have concerns, take them up with your booking department. I have nothing to prove, except that I belong here, just like everyone else." The captain didn't relent. He stood tall, his voice growing louder, so that everyone in the cabin could hear. "I don't care who you are, troublemakers. People who think they can buy their way into places they don't belong are not welcome on this flight." The words hung in the air, like an insult, cutting deeper than anything Snoop had experienced in a long time. Anger flared within him, but he held it in check, knowing that any outburst would give the captain more reason to escalate the situation. Instead, he took a deep breath, holding on to his composure. "I'm not causing trouble," Snoop said, his voice calm but firm. "But I won't let you talk to me like this. Do your job, and let me enjoy the flight I paid for." The tension in the cabin was palpable, stretching tight like a wire about to snap. The captain stood there, glaring at Snoop with an unmistakable challenge in his eyes. Then, with a huff of frustration, he turned on his heel and walked away, but not before delivering one last remark. "We'll resolve this soon, I promise you that." Snoop sat back in his seat, his chest tight with anger and determination. He knew this wasn't over. In fact, it was just the beginning. But as the hum of the airplane's engines grew louder, he realized that the true test of his resolve was just about to begin. The plane descended, and soon, Snoop could see through the window. A small, desolate airstrip stretched out before them. The narrow runway seemed almost lifeless, surrounded by barren fields. The dim runway lights cast an eerie glow, heightening the sense of isolation that filled the cabin. The passengers remained silent, some whispering quietly, others casting furtive glances at Snoop. He could feel the eyes on him, the weight of their judgment, but he stayed quiet. He knew this moment wasn't about them. It was about the principal. The captain emerged from the cockpit once more, his face hard, his voice devoid of empathy. "You," he said, pointing directly at Snoop. "Get off this plane. Someone like you has no place on this flight." The words were a public execution, an open declaration that Snoop wasn't worthy of the space he occupied, that he was less than the other passengers. Snoop stood up slowly, his posture calm but resolute. "I paid for this flight," he said, his voice low but firm. "You have no right to treat me like this." The captain smirked, his lips curling in a cold, fleeting smile. "I'm the captain here," he said, "and I have the final say. Now get off." Without further words, the captain motioned to a flight attendant, instructing her to remove Snoop's luggage. A moment later, the attendant appeared, unceremoniously tossing his bags onto the tarmac with a loud thud. Snoop's gaze didn't falter. He knew that this wasn't just a flight being disrupted. This was a turning point. The injustice was stark, but the fight was far from over. Each step he took toward the exit felt like a declaration of resistance. As the door slammed shut behind him, the finality of the moment settled in, but he refused to look away as the plane began to taxi. "This isn't over," he whispered to himself. And with that, Snoop stepped into the cold, desolate airstrip, ready for the next chapter of his fight for justice. Snoop stood alone on the empty runway, the harsh, cold wind biting at his skin, but his resolve was stronger than ever. The engine hum of the plane was now a distant memory, and the dark night around him felt both suffocating and isolating. He glanced down at the scattered luggage around him and, despite the bleakness of the situation, felt an undeniable fire ignite within him. His phone was useless, no signal to make contact, and there wasn't a single soul around to offer assistance. But Snoop wasn't one to crumble in the face of adversity. This moment was his turning point, and he would make sure the world would know the truth of what had happened. Without hesitation, he hoisted his bags, dragging them across the gravel path toward the small, nondescript airport building. It was a far cry from the luxury of first class, a dilapidated, dimly lit structure with flickering fluorescent lights overhead, the air stale with age inside. There was no one to greet him, no sign of help or hope. Just an empty information desk, a few plastic chairs lined against the walls, and the constant hum of an old vending machine. The lack of life in the space mirrored the isolation he felt. Snoop sank into one of the chairs, his head lowered as he tried to collect his thoughts. The weight of the injustice still hung over him, but his mind was already racing with plans. A faint noise from outside broke his concentration. He looked up to see headlights cutting through the darkness, and soon, an old pickup truck rolled into view, its engine coughing to a stop in front of the building. 3 figures emerged from the vehicle: a tall man with messy hair, a middle-aged woman with a headscarf, and a young boy, no more than 10, staring at Snoop with wide eyes, full of curiosity. The tall man stepped forward, his expression one of disbelief, then recognition. "Is that Snoop Dogg?" His voice trembled with excitement, though it was clear he was still processing the situation. Snoop managed a tired smile. "Yeah, it's me. And I could really use some help." The man turned to the others, speaking in a local dialect that made them gasp in surprise. The woman rushed forward, concern etched on her face as she clasped Snoop's hand. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice laced with worry. "What happened?" Snoop recounted the events calmly, but there was a distinct edge to his words. He was frustrated, tired, and shaken by the humiliation, but he knew he needed to stay composed. His story left them silent at first, their faces shifting from shock to outrage. Jamal, the tall man who had introduced himself, clenched his fists, his deep voice seething with anger. "This is unbelievable," he muttered. "How could they treat you like that? This isn't just wrong. It's an insult to all of us." The boy, still staring at Snoop with a mix of awe and concern, looked up at him and asked, "But you're famous. Why would anyone treat you like that?" Snoop crouched down to the boy's level, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes, even when you do everything right, people will still treat you unfairly," he said gently. "But the important thing is to never let them silence you. You have a voice, and you should always use it to stand up for what's right." The woman, Jamal's mother, stepped forward with a bottle of water and a scarf. She gestured to a scrape on Snoop's hand from when he'd been forced onto the tarmac. "You should take care of this. she said kindly. Snoop nodded in gratitude, feeling a wave of relief as the kindness of these strangers broke through the harshness of his ordeal. Jamal turned back to the truck. "We'll take you to the village," he said, his tone serious. "We've got a phone and internet there, so you can contact your people. You're not just fighting for yourself, Snoop. You're fighting for everyone who's been treated like this. We'll help however we can." Snoop climbed into the truck, wedged between Jamal and the young boy. The ride along the bumpy dirt road was jarring, but inside the truck, he felt a sense of warmth and support that had been missing since he boarded the flight. These people, who didn't know him personally, treated him with the respect and compassion he had been denied just hours before. As the truck rumbled along, Snoop allowed himself a moment of peace, knowing he wasn't alone in this fight. When they arrived at the village, Snoop was greeted not just with admiration, but with a sense of solidarity. The villagers, a close-knit community, gathered around him, eager to hear his story and express their outrage. They offered him food, water, and even helped him charge his phone. A group of young people, inspired by his presence, began recording Snoop's account of the events, eager to help share his story with the world. Sitting by the fire, surrounded by his new allies, Snoop felt a powerful emotion well up within him. Solidarity. This was no longer just about him. This was about every person who had ever faced injustice, every individual who had been marginalized or mistreated, simply because of who they were. As he looked into the determined faces of Jamal and the villagers, he made a silent vow to himself. "This isn't just about me," he thought. "I'll do what's right, not just for me, but for them, and for everyone like them." The journey from humiliation to determination took on a new meaning when Snoop returned to the United States. The memories of the captain's cold gaze and the blatant injustice he had endured on the flight weighed heavily on him, but they also fueled his resolve. He wasn't just coming back with a story to tell, he was coming back with a mission. After a brief meeting with his team, Snoop decided to act immediately. He sat down in front of the camera, his eyes sharp and his voice steady with conviction. He began a live stream, his deep voice filled with emotion, as he recounted the ordeal from beginning to end, from the moment he boarded the plane to being abandoned on that desolate airstrip. "Hello, everyone," he began, his voice strong, despite the gravity of what he was about to say. "I never thought I'd have to share this story with you, but I can't stay silent anymore. This isn't just about me. This is about the injustice that so many face every single day." He described the discrimination he faced in first class, the blatant disrespect from the flight attendants, the humiliation at the hands of the captain, and how he was ultimately abandoned in a remote location. His words were raw and heartfelt, leaving viewers shocked and enraged. He ended with a powerful statement. "This isn't just my issue. It's an issue for everyone who has ever been disrespected, mistreated, or marginalized, because they're different. I won't let this go. We deserve fairness and respect." Within hours, Snoop's video went viral. It amassed millions of views, and the hashtag, Justice for Snoop, began trending across Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. The support flooded in, with fans expressing their anger and admiration for Snoop's courage. People from all walks of life shared similar experiences, turning his personal struggle into a symbol for a much larger issue. The outrage didn't stop with fans. Prominent public figures, including Beyoncé, Jay-Z, Cardi B, and Oprah Winfrey, condemned the airline's actions, calling them a violation of human dignity. Activists, lawyers, and organizations advocating for civil rights rallied behind Snoop, demanding accountability and systemic reforms within the airline industry. In just 24 hours, over 500,000 people signed an online petition calling for action. The pressure on the airline was undeniable. Initially, the company responded with a vague statement, claiming the incident was under investigation, but this only fueled the public's anger further. People demanded real change, and the pressure mounted. Snoop's story had transcended the personal. It was now a movement, a call for justice and equality, and Snoop wasn't done yet. He partnered with top-tier lawyers to file a lawsuit against the airline and Captain Richard Wallace for discrimination, abuse of power, and defamation. His statement was clear. "We cannot let incidents like this be swept under the rug." The case became a symbol of resistance, drawing attention from all corners of the globe. As the lawsuit progressed, stories of similar injustices began to surface, forcing the airline industry to take a hard look at its policies. But this was just the beginning. Snoop had ignited a fire, and the world was watching. When the trial began, the courtroom was packed. Journalists, human rights advocates, and Snoop's loyal supporters filled the seats. Outside, the crowd gathered in solidarity, chanting slogans like, "Justice for Snoop and end discrimination." The case was no longer just about one man's humiliation. It was about everyone who had ever been unjustly treated. The airline's legal team, confident at first, tried to discredit Snoop's testimony, relying on tired defenses and flimsy excuses. But one by one, witnesses took the stand, and the truth came to light. Passengers who had witnessed the captain's discriminatory behavior spoke out, and surveillance footage from the airport exposed the ruthless nature of the captain's actions. The airline's attempt to justify the captain's behavior fell apart under the weight of evidence. Snoop's attorneys presented internal reports that showed a pattern of complaints against Captain Wallace, many of which had been ignored by the airline. When Snoop took the stand, his calm yet powerful words resonated throughout the courtroom. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This is about everyone who's ever been treated unfairly because of who they are. This fight isn't just mine. It's for all of us." After days of deliberations, the jury returned with a verdict. Captain Wallace was found guilty of abusing his authority, endangering a passenger, and racial discrimination. He was permanently stripped of his pilot's license and sentenced to prison. The airline was heavily fined and ordered to issue a public apology, implement service reforms, and provide mandatory anti-discrimination training for its staff. As Snoop stepped out of the courthouse, a wave of cheers greeted him. His eyes scanned the crowd, and he knew this was a victory. But it wasn't just for him, it was for everyone who had ever been silenced. "This is a victory," he said, his voice strong. "But we still have a long way to go. This is just the beginning." The applause and chants of justice filled the air, and as Snoop looked toward the future, he knew that this was only the start of a much larger battle for equality and justice. He was no longer fighting alone. The world waited with bated breath as the CEO of the airline appeared before the cameras, his face a mask of seriousness, yet tinged with remorse. The press conference was short, but impactful. "We extend our sincerest apologies to Mr. Calvin Broyce, Jr., better known as Snoop Dogg, and to the broader community for the unacceptable actions of our staff," the CEO stated. "This has been a costly lesson for us, and we are committed to change. We will reform our policies, ensuring thorough training to combat discrimination and uphold respect for every passenger, regardless of who they are." The apology aired nationwide, but the public's response was mixed. People weren't satisfied with empty words. They demanded tangible action, real consequences, and a clear commitment to change. The CEO's speech didn't quiet the growing storm of outrage. It only underscored that this issue went deeper than just one isolated incident. In the wake of the airline's press conference, Snoop Dogg stood before a crowd of supporters, a calm yet powerful presence, dressed in a sleek black suit, his face serious but his eyes shining with determination. He took to the podium. "Justice has been served," Snoop began, his deep voice carrying across the microphone. "But this isn't just about me. This is a victory for everyone who has ever been treated unjustly. For those who've never had the chance to stand up today, we've not only witnessed a verdict, but been reminded that we have the right to fight for fairness. We will not be silenced." The crowd, eyes full of admiration and resolve, cheered. Snoop's words resonated deeply within them. "But we still have a long road ahead," he continued, his voice unwavering. "This is not the end. It's the beginning of a greater fight. I am committed to continuing to use my voice, my platform, to advocate for justice, not just for me, but for all of us." True to his word, Snoop announced plans to partner with nonprofit organizations and establish a movement to combat discrimination in the aviation industry. He also pledged to create a legal support fund for those who couldn't defend themselves against such abuses. His campaign, Justice for Snoop, quickly gained momentum, bringing together artists, social activists, and major organizations. It was no longer just a hashtag. It was a symbol of the collective struggle for fairness, challenging the prejudices ingrained in society. Snoop's commitment to creating change was clear as he walked off the stage. his heart filled with purpose. His speech was a declaration that no one, regardless of their status or power, could escape accountability for mistreating others. In the days following the verdict, Snoop's image dominated not just entertainment news, but also social media platforms, news outlets, and even in-depth articles. He had transcended his celebrity status. Snoop had become a symbol of resilience in the fight against injustice. His powerful statement, "Justice is not just a concept, it's action," was widely quoted. The Justice for Snoop movement didn't stay confined to social media. Under pressure, major airlines began to reevaluate their policies. Many introduced mandatory anti-discrimination training, reviewed their hiring and promotion practices, and adopted more respectful customer service standards. One of the world's largest airlines even hosted a symposium on equity and customer service, inviting experts and Snoop himself to deliver a keynote address. "I'm not here to criticize or condemn," Snoop said at the symposium. "I'm here to push for change. We need an airline industry that is not only safe but fair, treating everyone with respect, no matter who they are or where they come from." The movement expanded beyond the airline industry, evolving into a broader conversation about systemic discrimination across various sectors. From the United Nations to nonprofit conferences, Snoop's story was cited as a catalyst for global change. People who had once been afraid to speak out now felt emboldened to stand up for their rights, inspired by Snoop's courage. One former first-class passenger shared on social media, "I used to think discrimination was something far away, but Snoop's story made me realize it can happen anywhere. From now on, I won't stay silent when I see injustice." Smaller airlines, even those not directly involved, swiftly updated their policies to avoid being caught in the tide of public outrage. One regional airline CEO remarked, "Snoop taught us a valuable lesson. Customer service isn't just about convenience, it's about respecting human dignity. That's something we must commit to improving." Despite all the praise he received, Snoop remained humble, always keeping his focus on the bigger picture. In a television interview, when referred to as a justice icon, he smiled modestly. "I'm not doing this to become a symbol," he said. "I'm doing this because I don't want anyone else to go through what I went through. If my story can make a difference, then that's the greatest thing I could achieve." Yet, his influence was undeniable. He was now mentioned alongside other prominent activists whose voices had driven social change. Though the journey had reached many milestones, Snoop knew there was still much work to be done. He continued collaborating with nonprofits, funding educational campaigns on human rights, and establishing a legal aid fund for the underprivileged. This fund supported victims of injustice, helping them find a platform to be heard and protected. "We've come a long way," Snoop said at a fundraising event, his voice filled with conviction. "But there's still so much to do. I can't do this alone. But together, we can change the world, one step at a time." As the weeks passed, Snoop finally arrived in the Maldives, the destination he had longed for after such an arduous journey. The private jet touched down on a small island, surrounded by pristine white sands and emerald waters. Stepping off the plane, he felt the cool ocean breeze against his face, carrying the fresh, salty aroma of the sea. The resort staff greeted him warmly, presenting him with flower garlands and radiant smiles. This heartfelt welcome seemed to wash away the exhaustion that had built up over the challenging months. Snoop was escorted to his overwater villa, where the gentle sounds of the ocean offered a sense of tranquility he had long been missing. He spent the first day soaking in the peace, basking in the infinity pool, and watching the sunset as the sky shifted from fiery orange to deep purple. But this trip wasn't just about relaxation, it was a moment for reflection. Snoop looked back on his journey, from the humiliations he had faced to the overwhelming support he had received from fans, advocates, and strangers around the world. On the second day, sitting on a quiet stretch of beach, Snoop decided to record a message for his supporters. The sun glinted off the waves as he spoke, his voice warm and full of gratitude. "Hello, everyone," he began. "I want to take a moment to say thank you. Thank you for standing with me, not just in this chapter, but in the bigger fight, the fight for justice and equality." He paused, gazing into the camera, connecting directly with his audience. "This victory isn't just mine, it's ours. It belongs to everyone who has ever felt wronged, unheard, or overlooked. We've shown that when we stand united, we can change the world." After sending his heartfelt message, Snoop walked barefoot along the beach, a soft chuckle escaping as the waves playfully lapped at his feet. As he looked toward the horizon, the rising sun affirmed that this moment wasn't just the end of one journey, but the beginning of another, one of continued advocacy and action. The trip became more than just a restorative break. It was a reminder of resilience, of how far he had come, and of how much more there was to be done. Snoop's commitment to change never wavered. From snorkeling to heartfelt conversations with the resort staff, every moment reinforced his dedication to amplifying the voices of the unheard. On his final evening in the Maldives, surrounded by close friends and staff, Snoop shared a toast, his words filled with gratitude. "We've weathered storms to be here, and that proves one thing," he said. "Nothing is impossible if we hold on to faith and determination. I know this journey is far from over, but tonight, let's celebrate this moment of hope and new beginnings." The next morning, as he stood on the deck of a yacht, preparing to leave the Maldives, Snoop inhaled deeply, savoring the peaceful air. This trip was more than just a vacation. It was a reminder of the power of unity and resilience. He knew that upon his return, the fight for justice would continue, but he was ready. With gratitude and hope fueling him, Snoop was prepared to face whatever came next. The laughter of Snoop Dogg echoed over the waves, marking the perfect end to one chapter of his life and the promising beginning of another. Snoop's story is not just about overcoming injustice, it's a testament to the strength of resilience and solidarity. From moments of humiliation to the courtroom where justice prevailed, and finally to the peaceful days in the Maldives, Snoop proved that anyone can create change when they stand up for what's right.